Netart's Bay has the best oysters up pretty much anywhere, and there's very few of them being served in Oregon.
Welcome back for another episode of Tending the Tides. I'm Megan Foucht, one of your hosts for today, and I'm joined by
John Bonkoski. Megan and I are both staff at EcoTrust, the organization producing this podcast.
In this episode, we're going to take a look at how oysters are grown, harvested, and eaten in Oregon. And I'm excited to get into a little bit of the history, as well as some of the challenges around cultivating oysters. But first, John, why are we spending so much time talking about oysters in this episode, and then we're going to revisit them again in future episodes?
Well, first, oysters are rad little organisms. They filter water, they build habitat, and they provide a healthy, protein-rich food source. So I'm just a huge fan of oysters in general. I also think they're really delicious. When it comes to aquaculture in Oregon, oysters are by far the largest product we produce from the state. I think the total value of aquaculture from our state is about $24 million a year. Oysters make up 20 million of that, so they are the single largest product we produce. And there's a saying in aquaculture, which is aquaculture is agriculture, and oyster farming, I would say, is one of the original regenerative agriculture practices.
That is quite a percentage of the total economic value of aquaculture in Oregon. But I think we need to start working in some nuance here, because what we're going to be talking about today is oyster farming. And yes, it is maybe the original kind of regenerative agriculture practice, but the distinction that we're making is between kind of a wild harvest and farmed systems.
Oysters have been on the Oregon coast for time immemorial. You know, people in Oregon have been eating oysters since humans existed here. And when white settlers arrived, that's how the commercial process began. They were harvesting wild oysters. But Megan, you've done a little research into the history of the farming here. Can you tell us a little more about what you've learned?
So first, I think we need to say it really was through the careful stewardship of indigenous peoples who live here that native oysters and these other resources like salmon and timber were really plentiful. And when white settlers arrived, they believed these resources would never run out, but we know that's not the case. As you said, white settlers developed the commercial oyster fishery in Newport in 1863 to supply the San Francisco market, primarily through wild harvest. Oysters were also commercially harvested in the Coos estuary around 1874. That wild harvest-based industry lasted a few decades until native stocks were nearly depleted from overharvesting, along with the impacts of other industrial activities like intensive logging in watersheds throughout the Coast Range that led to increased sedimentation in basin estuaries. So here's where the farming part comes in. In the early 1900s, the oyster industry was revived by the introduction of Ostrea gigas by J. M.E. Tsukamoto and Joe Miyagi, who were two friends from Olympia, Washington. They successfully transplanted oysters from Japan in Washington's Samish Bay and began farming them, jump-starting the oyster farming industry we see in the Pacific Northwest today.
So we are probably one of the oldest oyster farms in Oregon, established in 1907.
You're hearing from
Xin Liu, and I'm the owner of Oregon Oyster Farms. We bought the oyster company in 1997. So the pilings, the raft has been there for almost about 90 years.
Located in Newport, Oregon Oyster Farms is one of the oldest still operating oyster farms on the Oregon coast. And after more than 30 years in the industry, Xin Liu, who goes by Liu, knows a thing or two about oystering.
The challenging part is any type of aquaculture is like a type of art. You cannot just learn from the textbook, and you need to have some practical experience. Just like the music, you see a lot of musicians, they want to make music, but not a lot of them can put all the right note together to make a memorable music. Same thing for the aquaculture. I want to do some work so make our product is memorable product for all my customers. That's why I got me aquaculture business. Typically, we produce around 10,000 dozen oysters monthly in the shell, and we may have about 800-gallon oysters per month. And in general, on the Pacific Northwest, we depend on the hatchery seed, and they cannot reproduce themselves. So the hatchery produce the seed, we buy the seed from them and plant them into the Mother Nature.
So Liu is talking about Ostrea gigas oysters, now called Pacific oysters, which are the main type of oysters being farmed now and the ones transplanted from Japan by Tsukumoto and Miyagi. So, John, I did not know that Pacific oysters don't naturally reproduce in Oregon. Why is that?
The primary reason is that our coastal waters are just too cold. There's about a 2 to 3 week window in the summer when Pacific oysters spawn. And generally speaking, even in Oregon's estuaries, the temperature threshold doesn't quite reach what it needs to for larval development. So we rely on hatcheries to produce the spat or the baby oysters that we use in farming.
Okay, so that's interesting. Do Pacific oysters reproduce naturally in Washington state, where they do have kind of more estuaries and different conditions?
Yes and no. In certain conditions, you'll see a natural set, but the frequency and intensity is highly variable and unpredictable for similar reasons. The water is just too cold. So Washington growers also rely on hatcheries to have a more consistent farm production. And what I mean by a natural set is the ability for oysters to reproduce naturally. Because of biophysical differences between Oregon and Washington, there are times when a natural set does occur in Washington.
John, what do you mean by the biophysical differences between Washington and Oregon? How does that difference support a natural set for oysters?
As we heard in our last episode from Tom Calvanese, Oregon's water is really cold in part because of the upwelling on our coast. And if you've ever looked at a map of the Oregon coast, you'll notice it's almost a perfect straight line north-south, with a little curve around Astoria and maybe a little bump out around Port Orford. But otherwise, it's pretty much a straight line. You'll also notice that there aren't any barrier islands or anything that slows the wave action or breaks up the wind. So our coast gets that full brunt of what nature can bring. And that wind and wave action is why we get that upwelling that has brought up the cold water and the nutrients. We also have a really narrow continental shelf along the coast. If you look at a map, you'll see it gets really deep very quickly offshore. And finally, we have the coast mountain range that captures a lot of rain, and our rivers then pretty much drop almost straight into the ocean with relatively small estuaries. Whereas in Washington, they have the Puget Sound and the Hood Canal and the outer coast of the Olympic Peninsula, where they have large tidal flats and estuaries. So they just have more areas that are suited for potential oyster spawning.
Right. And like we heard from Liu, that means that oyster farmers have to rely on oyster seed production farms, which are also a kind of aquaculture. And we're actually going to hear a little bit more from another oyster farmer, Jed Bowers, owner of Haystack Shellfish Company, who operates in Netarts Bay, who's going to talk about exactly what you're mentioning. What are some of the biophysical elements that make this coastline a good place to farm oysters, and also some of the challenges?
What's neat about Netarts Bay is it only has really one freshwater inlet, and so that's Little Whiskey Creek. And so every day the water exchanges twice, so we get fresh ocean water twice a day into our bay. My lease in Netarts Bay, I'm the only oyster farmer that's legally allowed through my lease to grow oysters in the flip bag system. That's because Department of Fish and Wildlife and Department of Agriculture, they're trying to figure out how to protect the eelgrass that's in Netarts Bay. And so by regulating our uses in Netarts Bay and what we're doing, it helps preserve the eelgrass. And the eelgrass is important because that's basically the nursery for all the small little fish and crab and all types of things. And it's the foundation of the health of our bay. So it's important to take care of.
It's worth noting here that Jed and Liu both purchased and are operating their farms on existing leases. Starting a new oyster farm in Oregon is a totally different ballgame.
From the beginning, when a person wants to start a shellfish farm, right through to when that business is up and running and they're selling product to the public, Department of Agriculture is the one agency really that they work most closely with from start to finish.
You're hearing from Alex Manderson, a shellfish specialist with the Oregon Department of Agriculture, the agency that regulates shellfish in Oregon.
It's a small industry, but it's actually quite an expensive one to regulate. It doesn't really matter whether or not you have just a handful of growers, farmers in the state, or like a very large industry like Washington State. You kind of have to have the same infrastructure there to regulate. So I think that's probably one of the challenges, which ultimately it can be a limiting factor for the industry because we don't have the resources to be able to approve a lot of shellfish growing areas in the state simply because of the expense. We really only have like about 7 growing areas in Oregon where you can commercially grow shellfish, and that's primarily as a result of us having to concentrate our resources on those bays. It's expensive just to get an area open up, but then once you've got it open up, it has to be maintained as well. So it's not just like an initial cost outlay. It's like once you get an area approved, then you're committed to keeping that area classified and able to be farmed into the future.
As Alex mentioned, there are only 7 approved shellfish growing areas in the state, and any farm selling shellfish for human consumption must be located within one of these growing areas. ODA conducts water quality monitoring in the approved growing areas, monitoring which, as Alex said, incurs high maintenance costs, but is needed to protect the public from consuming unsafe shellfish. To acquire a new lease, an oyster farmer meets with Alex at the Oregon Department of Agriculture and other state agencies like Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife to make sure the site they've selected to farm is viable and within an approved growing area. Then they submit a formal application with a filing fee. The application goes out for public comment and comment by any resource agencies, local, county, and city governments, and tribes. What else am I missing there, John?
The Oregon Department of Ag then summarizes all comments and makes a decision about whether the application is approved. If the oyster grower is successfully granted a lease, they essentially get a rental agreement with the state to utilize the public land for oyster farming. Running alongside this process, the new oyster farmer applies for a federal permit with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. This comes into play for the growers who want to put any structures in the water that could impede navigation.
Right. So Liu uses pilings, essentially big poles that are driven into the estuary bottom at one location where he farms. And these were put into place nearly 90 years ago, which lets him grow oysters on rafts and keeps his oysters in deeper water, which he can access during any tide. And that's not always the case, right, John?
That's right. Most growers don't have that luxury. Here again is Jed, who grows his oysters in a flip bag system.
The day in the life of an oyster farmer it revolves around the tides, because the tides lead to access to our farms. And Netarts Bay is a really shallow bay, so we get stuck out on the farm all the time. The boat sits on the sand, and we just got to wait till the tide comes back in. But it can be all types of day. Like this morning, I was there at 4:30 this morning and avoiding the tide so I could get in and out. And today we brought oysters that we had harvested yesterday, and we sorted the oysters at our shop and then rebagged them in our float bags, and then brought them back out to the bay to hang on the blocks, the lines that my company uses to grow oysters. And then we grabbed more bags from the bay and brought them back into the shop. We sorted and harvested what we needed to sell today. And then we put those on ice and put the oysters we're going to bring back out on ice so we could do it again tomorrow.
Most oyster farmers, including Lou and Jed, produce Pacific oysters, Ostrea gigas, the transplant oyster from Japanese waters we mentioned earlier in the episode. What we know as Pacific oysters were formerly known as Japanese oysters, but likely due to anti-Japanese sentiments and racism during World War II, they were renamed. And it's this oyster, specifically the Miyagi strain from the Pacific coast of Japan, that still captures a large market share of both the domestic and international market for Oregon oysters. Ostrea gigas translates to big oyster, and in some cases we're talking really big, dinner plate-sized oysters.
So normally the typically our oysters we have is, we call the special is 10 inches above. And the jumbos is 7 to 10 inches. 6 to 7 inches is the extra large. 5 to 6 inches is large. And the 4.5 inches to about 5.5 is our mediums. And then 3.5 to 4.5 is our small. Then 3 to 3.5 is our extra small. 2 to 3 is petite.
But, as Jed describes, offerings from Oregon oyster farmers are varied.
So we have 3 names. One we call a wine oyster. We do wine events, like we just did one at Bjornson's. And so we found that the wine industry prefers a smaller oyster when we're serving them raw. And so we do about 1.5 to 2 inch oyster for them. And that we just call it the wine oyster. Our main oyster, our pride and joy, is called the Torques. And that is between 2.5 to 3.5 inches with a really deep cup. They're a specific size, shape that people are looking for in our Torques. And then we have the knee tarts, which is 3.5 to 4.5 inches, which as well is really deep cup, full of meat, really nice tumbled oyster. Our oysters are described as a briny kind of an oyster, very briny, fresh. You'll find the oyster industry has become a lot like the wine industry, where there's the explanation for every type of flavors. Like some will say they're mushroomy, others are earthy, and others are briny, and so ours are considered briny.
Licensing and production challenges aside, there is a critical component to ensuring Oregon's oyster industry stays alive, and that's you and me, the consumer. Many small oyster farm businesses are independent and find footholds in different niches. In addition to selling domestically, for example, Liu, who is originally from Qingdao, China, exports Oregon oyster farm products to Taiwan, Hong Kong, and China as well.
I came to the U.S. and understand the Chinese culture. Then I understand, spending enough time in the U.S., I understand the culture here. And I think a culture play a critical role for the business. Even you have the language skill and still the culture, you have to respect each other's culture. How to minimize the difference and to improve the exposure to each other, to find the common ground, to sell your product. And, to understand the culture is critical. I look at the market. In the U.S. market, they are very competitive on the smaller size. But on the bigger size, it's less competitive because it's a lot of labor work. But we have the unique location and we will target the bigger size oysters. And in Taiwan, because they have the typhoon season, they cannot do the bigger size oysters. They don't want the smaller. Less than 5 to 6 complain to me. So that's why we target the Taiwan customer, because not only my language skill, but also the sizes we can grow, they like.
Finding markets for oysters is not always so easy. I think I saw something that said like 90% of Oregon harvested seafood goes anywhere but Oregon. And to me, that's crazy. Like, why? We have, I think, Netarts Bay has the best oysters up pretty much anywhere, and there's very few of them being served in Oregon, and that's crazy. I do understand the logistics of getting my oysters to, say, Salem, McMinnville, Eugene, Bend. Getting those away from the coast is really hard.
John, you have a particular perspective here about the potential for the oyster sector to grow. And it's not a perspective that just came out of nowhere. You've been working for years, in particular at EcoTrust, around issues related to coastal communities and fisheries. So can you talk a little bit about what that perspective is that you have?
Yes, I definitely have a perspective. And as I said earlier, I'm a huge fan of oysters for a number of reasons. And I'm also an advocate for aquaculture in general. I think we have a huge potential for growth in Oregon in our aquaculture industry that would create a really robust local food producing sector. I said earlier, Oregon produces about $24 million a year in aquaculture products, most of which is oysters. But that's way behind our neighbors. Washington produces about $275 million a year. That's second in the nation. California produces $118 million. That's sixth in the nation. And Idaho produces $41 million. That's 10th in the nation. So we are like way behind our neighbors when it comes to potential for aquaculture.
That's pretty remarkable, considering that we have this amazing coastline that we've been talking about. But why is Oregon's aquaculture industry so small relative to its potential and relative to our neighbors?
I think there are a few things at play here. First, we have just generally a negative public perception of aquaculture in Oregon. And there's a number of reasons for that. I think there were some big failures in the 1970s around salmon farming. And then you couple that with a really strong wild caught fisheries ethic in Oregon, one that EcoTrust has definitely been a part of advocating for. We love our wild capture fisheries here. And so I think that kind of general ethic has really swayed people away from aquaculture. But there is so much more we can do in aquaculture beyond salmon farming, and that's not really what we're focused on at all here. There are ways for us to expand this industry that suits what Oregon is capable of, what Oregon would like to do, and I think oysters is one of those places where we could really look. And there are 22 estuaries in Oregon. We only grow in about 7 of them. And I think there's just possibility for us to look at and expand on that and really look at what's possible out there.
So going back to what you just said about the number of estuaries we have compared to the number we grow in, that's kind of with good reason, right? Because that's partly due to limitations like water quality and the suitability of various plots where Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife have provided approval. But couldn't we also draw on the expertise of oyster farmers to improve areas that are currently not suitable?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things we want to recognize with oyster farming is that it is a stewardship practice.
Everyone we've heard from in today's episode mentioned that stewardship ethic. Jed, Lou, and Alex all mentioned that bent toward caring for the environment, stewarding the environment, as a key part of the oyster industry.
In mariculture, people really care about the environment that their product is being grown in. Take oysters, for example. They're a direct byproduct of where they're grown. What is being dumped into the bay on purpose or just naturally it's what they're eating, it's what they're feeding, so it affects their taste, it affects their health, their growth. There's so many things that go into it. And so we have a vested interest to take care of the bay that we're working in. You have good stewards out there working to make sure that their product is as healthy and beneficial as possible.
We need to produce the good quality or high premium oysters to the customers, but also we interact with the Mother Nature. As each location has its unique environmental conditions, you have to learn the physical, chemical, biological conditions. So you try to put all the factors together and make our work friendly to the ecosystem.
I think when it's done well, there's great benefits to the ecosystem and just the general environment. I've had the industry tell me a lot of different stories about how they've sort of moved into an area that was just like barren tide flats that was nothing growing out there, just miles of sand. And then once they started planting oysters, it really changed the whole ecosystem there. It slowed water movement down. It provided sort of a reef structure that allowed eelgrass to move in, and that means that then you have animals moving into that area as well.
John, considering that oyster farming is currently the most developed aquaculture industry on the Oregon coast, what are some lessons people could bring forward into what they're hoping to develop?
I think one of the major lessons is really the suitability question. Not every form of aquaculture is going to be suitable for us, both because of biophysical reasons and because of public perception. So I think really working towards that, recognizing what is the right types of aquaculture for Oregon, working within our processes here to steward lands and waters so that they are benefits from the practices of aquaculture, and really just building on that strengthening public perception. I think those are some lessons that we can push forward on as we try to expand and think about the industry.
One of the things that's coming up for me, and we actually heard Tom Calvanese mention this as well, is just the work. It's hard work. And oyster farmers are no stranger to that.
Yeah, absolutely. This is extremely hard work. And I think when we think about trying to build natural capital, trying to create a triple bottom line economy, we're not the ones out there in the middle of the night in the winter when it's raining and the tides are out, flipping bags and doing all the hard work to grow food for our communities and for our state. And it's a really important activity. And I think we should really honor the work and really hold the folks who are doing that hard work up and make sure that they're part of the thinking about this, putting it forward. And I think that's what really excites me about how we're approaching this work on the coast and really thinking about how people are stewarding the lands and waters for Oregonians.
The other thing that's exciting to me is that we're talking about estuaries, which are these natural places of abundance, and that we're also talking about the relationship between estuaries and people, these relationships that have been in place for a long, long time, for millennia.
It is exciting because there is this shared resource that is being stewarded for us by oyster farmers. You know, no one owns tidelands in Oregon, which is another difference between Washington and Oregon, and I think an important one. And we're all part of this larger process of being stewards of the land and water. And I really think it's an important piece of that human connection to our estuaries and to our coastlines. It's, I think, a great and important part of the work we're doing in our partnership.
In our next episode, we're going to hear more about the efforts to restore and the interest in eating Olympia oysters, the only native and naturally occurring oyster in the Pacific Northwest. Here's a preview of our conversation with Chef Jack Strong.
My name is Jack Strong. I am a part of the Confederate Tribes of Siletz Indians. My role here is executive chef of the Alice Inn and Spa. Olympia oysters also was the oyster of the Pacific Northwest, of the Puget Sound and farther down south into California. It tells a story of, really for me, coastal peoples and our reliance on how we were sustained by not only oysters, but other shellfish, mussels, and how that really was a part of life for coastal tribes, which I relate to, being from the coast.
This episode was hosted and co-written by me, Megan Foucht, and John Bonkoski, edited by Susie O'Neill, co-produced by Emily Chen, Caitlin Rich, and Tyson Razor. Music by Imagined Nostalgia and Boxwood Orchestra. Illustrations by Tony Sterling and design by Eldai De La Cruz. This podcast was made possible by our funders at the Builders Initiative. The Builders Initiative invests in and collaborates with nonprofits, businesses, and others, working towards sustainable solutions to societal and environmental challenges. Finally, this podcast is a production from EcoTrust, where we work in partnership at the intersection of equity, economy, and environment. Learn more about EcoTrust at ecotrust.org.